I'd like to thank all the panelists for such stimulating and interesting papers. Each one of them was able to suggest a very great deal in a very short amount of time. Confronted with this wide range of cultural artifacts, time frames, and mode of analysis, I found myself wishing yet again that I were Vinnie Dada. Vinnie, of course, would have brought much more expertise and insight to the task of discussing sort of the heroine in modern French popular culture. I merely have a few observations and questions that I hope can start us off on a wider discussion. To briefly remind you of the three arguments, Elizabeth Everton offers a detailed analysis of three instances in the second half of 1898 when anti-Dreyfusards made heroines out of violent, or at least potentially violent, women. In Fergus, a theatrical reworking of the affair, the play culminates in the character standing in for Lucie Dreyfus, shooting her traitorous spouse, what we might call a happy ending. 3 months later, in real life, so-called, Valentine Palmier shot a Dreyfusard journalist, an act that the anti-Dreyfusard press initially treats as an exemplary form of restoring a family's honor. Palmier was displaced, though, by a more suitable role model, Berthe Henry, who was seen as forswearing actual violence and using the legal system to restore her family's honor. In all three cases, Everton sees women represented as being forced to transgress gender norms in response to their own victimization and that of the nation, an appropriately feminine form of heroism. Robin Walls takes us through his effort to make sense of the appearance of a major female protagonist in the sprawling Fantômas series, Hélène, the daughter of the master criminal himself. Hélène is anomalous in the Fantômas universe, neither victim nor entirely criminal nor entirely on the side of justice. She is active, smart, at ease at all levels of society, a master of disguise, and independent, until a long-brewing romantic subplot blunts her force. Walls identifies earlier female characters in popular fiction who embody some of Hélène's ascribed characteristics, but Hélène remains unique in his account, neither comfortably contained in the imaginary of popular crime fiction, nor congruent with the expectations of the femme nouvelle or the new woman. Joelle Zoolander focuses our attention on French actresses, I use the period term, in Hollywood films in the interwar period. She thus shifts the study of film as a transnational and cosmopolitan phenomenon to an earlier period than the one considered by Vanessa Schwartz. And she shows how these films with their spunky heroines could provide young French women with role models or imaginary compatriots as they navigated changing gender norms in France. Zoolander stresses how Hollywood films offered these actors roles in which they played active, feisty, and comedic characters rather than tragic and subordinated ones, thus opening imaginative possibilities for French audiences as well. For both fictive characters and viewers, then, work in these films is depicted as a means to save the day, hold on to ideals, and have adventure. In trying to think about these three papers together, I was struck by something that Everton said. It's the question, what makes a heroine? The answer, circumstance, particularly crisis. The crisis of the family, the crisis of the nation, but circumstance makes a heroine. This seems to me key to the three analyses that we have heard today. That is, within a larger gender system in which activity is almost invariably paired with masculinity, and in which heroism demands action of some kind, there must be forces beyond female agency that would be necessary to impel or to compel the kinds of actions recognizable as heroic. And we can see the power ascribed to circumstance in explaining, legitimizing, and even endorsing the abandonment or exceeding of norms of femininity across all three papers. A consideration of circumstance also leads me to stress the degree to which all three papers explore relations between the fictive and the real, and show how complex and multivalent those relations can be. It's perhaps easiest to see in Everton's paper, where a drama is contrasted to the two tales of real-life female revenge. But this is no simple opposition. Fergus is, after all, a roman à clef, whose power depends on its figures being recognizably read as real people, at the same time that it is, of course, a wish fulfillment. Everton also points to the ways in which Mesdames Pommier and Henri fulfill or fail to fulfill roles straight from boulevard melodrama. We also know from this and Robin Wells's other work that the Fantômas series, like most French crime fiction, did not exactly aspire to strict realism. But these novels do chart a vision of modern European and sometimes international society and of social and economic structures and relationships. You can't have crime without sort of outlining what the order of society that's being violated. And similarly, the plots of the Hollywood films that Zoolander discusses are grounded, even at their most lighthearted, in realities like financial loss, the need for female employment, and the vicissitudes of immigration. And in passing, she points out that some actors, like Lily Pons, actually lived out the roles that they had in these films. So the relationship between what we loosely call reality and representation sort of are very, very complex in all three cases. The importance of circumstance in all these narratives, whether real, fictional, or some combination of the two, does raise some questions for me about the larger cultural salience our panelists ascribe to them. I note the tension in all three papers between viewing these heroines as ordinary women and treating them as exceptional, whatever the cause of their extraordinary actions. That is, there's constantly an attempt to tie them to particular circumstances under which it would be possible, for instance, for women to restore or honor. There are particular circumstances under which women can save the day. What I'm asking, I think, is to what extent do these figures actually challenge, negotiate, or reinforce gender codes, and to what lasting or ephemeral effect? And this is less a criticism, really, than a request for more information, right? That is, what is the dynamic here between a kind of affirmation because of exceptionalism and a kind of real attempt to push at the boundaries of gender norms? I also find myself wondering to what extent our panelists attribute to genre or narrative expectations the ways in which female heroism can be imagined and figured in popular culture, since all three are tied to one extent or another to existing cultural forms. Do these cultural interventions actually shift or alter sort of these kind of narrative or genre expectations? Do they lay the groundwork for more sophisticated, less sophisticated, more reactionary versions of the heroine? Or do they engage in a kind of unceasing semiotic guerrilla warfare where you try something, it fails, you try again? This in turn raises questions about authorship and audience, which I will treat very superficially. Sort of how significant is it to understanding these three moments in cultural history that the producers of these texts are predominantly men, or that Madame Henri was to some extent stage managed by male anti-Dreyfusards? That is, what kind of weight do we want to give them in terms of a larger understanding of their cultural context? Similarly, all three papers make glancing reference to reception. Reception, we all know, very vexed topic. But I'd like to hear more about the Dreyfusard reading of these avenging heroines.
Not good.
Yeah, that one's not a real stretch. But about the afterlife of Hélène in the kind of Fantômas fandom, which is a kind of ongoing sort of discourse, and about the emulation and cultivation of moxie among interwar women. And before I drift off into dozens of smaller questions, please do not get me started on the body politics here, the cross-dressing, the female masquerade. I would just like to thank all three panelists for their fascinating work and open the floor to a wider discussion of the heroine in modern popular culture. So because we're being filmed, I think sort of if you have a question, we need you to use the microphone. It does not make your voice louder, it just records it. So do we have any questions for the excellent panelists? Andrea?
This question is for Robin about the fantomas and these action heroines. You talk about the kind of literary antecedents, and I'm wondering to what extent you're thinking about the real life kind of antecedents. And I'm thinking particularly of this kind of slew of women beginning in the 1880s who commit these crimes of passion, what are framed as crimes of passion in the courtroom, but are actually following these kind of honor scripts. And these women are kind of portrayed as heroines. And I'm also thinking of the kind of cult of physical fitness in this period and women's magazines in which women are being portrayed in a very positive light, doing things like fencing, shooting, engaging in shooting contests, swimming. So I'm just wondering what kind of connections you're drawing from the fiction and the reality, between the fiction and reality.
Well, the short answer to that is like, this is new, this is a side project. I hadn't really thought about that one fully. The thing that comes to mind right away is just, Hélène is a heroine. I mean, her emotions, for the most part, don't get the most of her. It's like, it's not a crime of passion and stuff because it's not her hysterical side that's taking over, I don't think. And so, what were you thinking?
Passion are portrayed as such in the courtroom, but really some of the scripts that they follow are about having no remorse and going and shooting someone who has betrayed you or who has libeled you in the press.
Right. Well, there's no... Hélène, I don't think ever has any remorse, so maybe that's a connection. I don't know. I have not thought about it in terms of... I was just looking at those that kind of fictional genealogy. So that's something to do. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, these were wonderful, as always. Thank you. I was wondering on the Dreyfus paper, was there any equivalent on the other side, or is it just would that have made things worse, or is it just the conservatives that can imagine a woman defending her honor by doing this kind of?
I haven't run into on the Dreyfus Sword side. Obviously, there's Lucy Dreyfus, and she's a very, very different. She's not Louise Fergus. She's a very different sort of heroine. She really is elevated as a heroine. And actually, and Ruth Harris has pointed this out very nicely. The anti-Dreyfus Swords had a great deal of respect for Lucy Dreyfus. They didn't agree with her. But they found her to be really exemplary. Her heroism is something different. It's this kind of tireless seeking to restore her husband's honor through restore his name and restore him through the courts. They don't, in terms of kind of violent heroines, not so much. They actually, and Christopher Forth has done a beautiful discussion of this. They kind of shy away from heroines, the Dreyfus Swords. In a way, the anti-Dreyfus Swords, for all that they're somewhat socially conservative, are actually much quicker to embrace women in their movement and as kind of public images.
Right, but which in a way makes sense.
It does,
right,
yeah.
Because that's one of the things that they, amongst all the enemies that are trying to destroy France, right?
Yes.
Would be, women and feminism or anything like that would be seen. So that's why I'm wondering if it just wasn't, that trope wasn't available on the other side. And Lucy, it's all about faithfulness, right?
Yes, it's
fidelity,
deep, deep loyalty and fidelity,
Yeah.
and it's not, her action is much subtler. There is actually there's a Dreyfus Sword subscription for Lucy Dreyfus that takes place before, I'm forgetting exactly when, it's earlier in 1898, but it's nothing like the Henri subscription. And the Henri subscription really is framed not just for, the memory of Colonel Henri, but also for the assistants and Madame Henri as well. It's for both parts of the couple. But there's nothing, they're not able to kind of mobilize people in support of Lucy Dreyfus in the same way.
After you, sort of, Karen. She's been waiting patiently.
Thank you. One very short comment and a couple of questions. The short comment is about circumstances making the heroine. You know, you might add to that it's the circumstances, but then it's the choice that the woman makes,
Yes.
given those circumstances, that makes the heroine. So I think there's two pieces to that that one can explore. I want to congratulate you all on 3 very interesting papers, but I especially want to ask Joelle and Robin about the reception question, and who, in particular with Fantomas and the Hélène, who were the buyers for these serials and serial novels? And for Joelle, when do we get the film festival?
Yeah, right. You're right. Yeah. Go ahead.
In terms of viewership, what I've been doing and trying to figure out is how much publicity movies are making, and then looking also, and I'm in the sort of process of that, looking at the number of screens they appear on. So looking at like if you look at the Paris weeklies and you sort of, or the daily newspapers, right, they run all the movies and they show which theaters they're running in, and trying to figure out how long are they there, and then how many theaters. I mean, some movies, you know, they blow right by and they're there for like a week and gone, but other movies will stay longer. The issue, of course, with movies, just in the sense, just like the work I did on radio, we don't think of it this way, but of course it's completely ephemeral, because any movie is going to be in the theater for only a certain number of weeks, and then they're gone, and so they're replaced by some other movies. If you're talking, again, about 400 something movies a year, they don't stay on screens nearly as long as movies do today. They don't, and so you're really talking about tropes much more, and characters. Certain of them are clearly remembered, but how they're remembered or not is that's an interesting question as well. So there's demand for serials like Myrna Loy's Thin Man, obviously, you know, she with William Powell, then they do several Thin Man movies. And so Ginger Rogers, the same thing, right, with various, although most of the movies she'd appeared in were not with Fred Astaire. So you have these recurring, so it's sometimes a matter of how many movies they're in, how long are those movies there, but box office is really hard to figure out. It's really difficult. So I try to sort of think about them more in the aggregate rather than, even though
Are
the
there
stories
studio
are great,
records you can get into?
For me now,
Are there movie studio records?
yeah, there is some of it, but again, you know, they'll just release it in France and it'll be there for a couple weeks or whatever. Records of how much money each box office made. We have information of how much they cost. We get a sense if they recouped their costs, but it's not always that easy to figure that out. And in Hollywood releases, you're talking again the same thing in international release, so it's complicated. But yes, that is another place to go. But things get really confused, and if you start using memory, it gets really confused. I just learned this because, of course, I was going to end with who I think is the woman who on 1930 screens in America probably had the most moxie and was sort of seen as the absolute most sort of courageous woman who did everything possible to fulfill her destiny and goals and save her family, and that would be Scarlett O'Hara. But she did not appear in France until 1950. So any memory that anybody has of her as an image of gumption in the 30s, if they read the book in translation, but not on the film screen. So in fact, she doesn't exist as a pre-war character for film, even though obviously for us she does. And so again, you have to be careful, and that's what I've learned, of figuring out when are these movies actually released in France, how much publicity is there for these movies, and all that. And so that's what I've been trying to figure out. How many ads are there? Where, you know, who's in them, and is there an expectation that they'll know who this star is, right? They'll know, obviously, Clark Gable, but would they know Myrna Loy? Would they know Barbara Stanwyck? And what I'm finding out is yes, they likely would, but how much, it's hard.
so far as I know, Fantomas is pretty much a male-dominated genre. It's hard to tell, and I think, if I remember right, Anne-Marie Thies in her study, which she just had like a handful of these older women, that she interviewed about what they read when they were younger, right, in the Belle Epoque. And only one, when she asked about Fantomas, even said, "My brother read that. I didn't read those. But my brother read it." Right. So it's hard to know how to generalize from that. But the things I suppose that I came up with, if I had to be put on the spot, is that there seems to be an abundance of women criminals in popular literature up before Hélène. And when it comes to women detectives, before the Great War, we have these two Ethels, right? And they're Americans, right? They're not French. So this is why Hélène doesn't really totally fit into any of the categories that I can come up with that way. And the roman populaire of the 19th century, of the late 19th century, doesn't really help much, because even when it becomes a crime or adventure story that's predominantly male-dominated, let's say Monsieur Lecoq of Gaboriau or Chéri Bibi of Gaston Leroux, these things usually have like 2 or 3 books in the collection of the big book of the kind of epics, 800-page, story. Often you get through like book 1, and then there's this like book 2 will like involve some kind of romance that you go back in time, and so a lot of these authors would mix these sort of romantic stories into it, but like who those stories are really for, I'm not entirely sure. By default, I'll just say these are like the imaginations of guys, but I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask the reception question in a slightly different way.
I can tell you that the social workers wanted to know if the boys were reading Detective.
Okay, there you go.
Yes. There you go. No, my question was asked.
So I'd like to pick up on Michael's question, especially for Robin and Joelle, and that's the issue of what are the impacts of these media, and especially based on what you just said, Robin, that it's read by guys, and there's that saying that I never knew existed until recently, cherchez la femme. When a crime is committed or a murder is committed, cherchez la femme, and so you have these images on the novels of idealized female bodies that are very sexy or sexualized.
Right.
And in the case of, the necklace stolen, it looks like she's been raped. So they're very, they really spark the imagination. And these are, as you said, the fantasies and imaginations of men. And so it's also looking, when you say that a lot of the female characters were criminals, it's also bringing out the dark side of the female character. And I don't expect you to be able to address this question because it does have to do with reception too, but what does it do for the advancement of women in a gender system or a patriarchal society? And similarly for Joelle, I look at those women, they're all beautiful and sexy, and also the creation of the male imagination. And what does it do for the body images of ordinary women in France or anywhere? And with regard then to Liz, yours is, I think, more complex for the effect it might have on women's self-conception or sense of empowerment. So I don't know if you can address those questions, but I think Michael was really right in saying what are the long-term, what are we talking about here in terms of female power, if that's going to be part of the topic of this session.
Well, I would say, obviously, they're also, in this case, all white. They are also, there are a lot of things. And so the images of who these women are do have to be unpacked. And I think there's a kind of, there's a body here that most of us, I will say I can't. I'm not saying anything about anybody else. Although in my head I'm Cindy Crawford. I always. And I think you're right. I think there is that. Now, obviously, along with this, there's a couple things I would say. First, there's always the how do you get to be that? So a lot of the fashion magazines, the women's magazines are giving you, they look like Cosmo today, right? They look like fashion magazines today. How do you attain that look? And both by exercise, by girdle. So there's all of these ways in which you can become this, and they encourage you to be beautiful. They encourage you in these kinds of ways. It's limiting in a way, but I also think what's very interesting is that in terms of work and the other side of it, there's a tremendous, at least what I've seen, a conversation going on. I did this in the paper, was it last year or the year before, I can't remember, but talking about advice columns and women talking about work a lot and asking questions about their work and wanting advice for work and thinking about how that's part of their lives. And there's no, there's a real positive response to that. Not only to work when you are single, to try to come up with ways to fulfill your dreams. If you want to be a pilot one day, maybe that will be a possibility. To let people know that work matters, that women's work inside and outside the home has real value, and I think that there's a push, and I think this is part of that, to give that value to women. And in a sense, I think it's a survival skill, right? In a time where you need the money. I mean, it's not something that you don't need. But I really see that as a really positive way. Very different from what I found on the radio, where I found women working on the radio was almost always ended in tragedy, right? It ends usually with them, a prostitute dying on the street of cholera or whatever, tuberculosis, something. But you know, this is not that story, and so I think that it's part of a kind of support, and you see it in the letters to the editor, you see it in the responses in advice columns, particularly, and Sarah knows this, in the magazine Confidence, which has all of this give and take where they ask a question: should a woman continue to work for her husband's business? If he's starting a business after they get married, she doesn't want to, he wants her to, and generally the reading public says, come on girl, work, you know what I mean? And there's a kind of surprising sort of support for women in public sphere, women working, I think that I've enjoyed reading about, and I think in the 1930s especially since we know, obviously, they don't have the vote, they're making their lives fulfilled without that beautiful piece, right? They're coming up with ways to be public citizens, to be fully active in that sphere, and I think that's part of what's going on here.
I loved being on this panel with these papers because I was like watching or listening to Joelle's Moxie Women, and I'm going, wow, maybe Ellen was Moxie before her time, you know? But at the same time, like Tony, like when she talks about Tony and Suez, I'm going, oh, that's Ellen, you know? But Tony ends up sacrificing herself, which sounds a lot like Liz's women to me. So those were just things that kind of came up. Also, I don't have great shakes for Ellen, like here as a character, and with Joelle's thing, I think about, I mean, haven't there just been tons of articles? There's a very famous one about American cinema, about working women, right, going to the cinema and seeing women like themselves up on the screen, right? And I get that Liz Connor has, from Australia, has The Spectacular Modern Woman is the name of her book. And has a chapter on the star-struck girl, I think she calls it, right? And I hold out little for mine, but I hold out a lot for Joelle's.
In terms of kind of how female, you know, how any Dreyfus Sword women would look at someone like Madame Henri. With Madame Henri, it's actually rather interesting because we do have a little sampling of reactions to her in the form of the messages in the Henri subscription. And so when people sent in their money, they could have their name printed in the paper, or they could have a little message printed. And there were a lot of people, especially women, who responded to Madame Henri. They said, I'm the wife of a soldier, you're the wife of the soldier. Or they responded to little, the child, little Joseph Henri was 4 years old, and so they had women and actually children's names being published saying, a big kiss for my little friend, So there were, they were seeing her and they were they were responding to her very positively, and they said, you're really heroic, you're really brave. But you're also a victim. I feel for you, I feel bad for you. The other thing I'd like to point out is, all of us are talking about women who are generally talked about men, but the person who really stage managed Madame Henri was Marianne de Beauvais, who was this feminist novelist. She was a frondeuse until the Fronde got too Dreyfus Sword and she quit. She wrote, when she was at the Fronde, she wrote an article basically decrying the idea of the eternal feminine and saying women are women are what they make themselves and are what, they are forced to become by different circumstances. And so she is the one who's putting out this idea, well, she not just said, this isn't a lawsuit, she was going to kill him. And she's just decided, okay, well, I gotta stay strong for my kid, and I'm not gonna go to jail because that's where I would probably go. She probably would get, point of fact, she would probably have gotten off. Valentine Pommier got off. She was found not guilty. But so I think that there's an intervention here in what could have been, and the Dreyfus Sword certainly thought that the anti-Dreyfus Sword, that Trumont, especially at La Libre Parole, was kind of pulling Madame Henri's strings. But we have an intervention here, and it could have gone in I think the story could have gone in a very different direction had they not tapped Beauvais to write that article. She took it in a different direction, and she took it in kind of an unsettling direction, in terms of, I guess, to use Lou Roberts' classic adjective, she took it in a disruptive direction. She busted it a little bit. I have a question for Robin, actually. So I'm going to stop talking about the Dreyfus Affair. I am a giant mystery fan.
Oh, okay, right. Sure.
And actually my preferred genre is kind of, late 19th, early 20th, into about the 30s, mysteries. And I love mysteries with female protagonists.
Okay.
And mysteries written by women.
Right.
And there's actually, in the Anglophone mystery world, there's a lot of mysteries written by women about women sleuths, earlier than Hélène.
Yes.
So I was wondering, is there anything like that in France? Is Miss Boston the first one? Because the Americans did have a couple, and the English did have a couple of female, kind of one-off female sleuths or recurring female sleuths.
Right. In my notes, I refer to a few of those that precede Miss Boston. My reading, the reading I've done says exactly the same thing, and that's another one of these issues, which is pretty late to appear on the scene. Yeah, and I also think about Lou Roberts and the modern woman being associated with the American and the English woman, and you're absolutely right.
Well, I wondered too, when you were describing Hélène, she struck me less as kind of a heroine of a detective novel and more as kind of a thriller heroine. I'm thinking not so much like King Solomon's Mines, like the kind of colonial. I mean, especially since she starts in South Africa, she reminds me of this kind of fantasy of the colonial woman, a woman who's kind of, again, by circumstance, removed from staid domesticity and a little bit more daring, like the girl from the Wild West. I mean, I think Study in Scarlet, Mary is kind of like that, and in Sherlock Holmes, and there's a couple of other kind of archetypes like that.
Right. A friend of mine wrote, what's her name? The one, Scandal in Bohemia.
Yes, Irene Adler.
Irene Nadler, right.
Oh, but also the Noble, I'm sorry, I'm a big mystery geek. The Noble Bachelor, there's a whole thing with this daring girl from like California or from Oregon or something.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Other questions from the audience? Then I'd like to thank you all for joining us and thank the panelists again.